In the final days of Jerusalem, when the weight of prophecy pressed against the city walls and Babylon's shadow stretched over the land, the streets of Zion echoed with fear, betrayal, and silence. The warnings of judgment were not whispered anymore. They were shouted by a prophet named Jeremiah, a man scorned by his own people for daring to speak what no one wanted to hear. Yet in the noise of rebellion and the violence of politics, a different voice was preparing to be heard, not from a throne, not from a pulpit, but from the heart of a servant. He was not Hebrew by birth. He held no titles of honor in the court. He was a eunuch, a foreigner from Ethiopia, stationed in the palace of a doomed king. To most, he was just another functionary in the machinery of power, unnoticed and easily forgotten. But heaven had not overlooked him. His name was Ebed-Melech, which means servant of the king, a fitting name, yet he would prove to be more than a servant to any earthly monarch. In his hidden faithfulness, in his quiet resolve, he would become a servant of righteousness. This story does not begin with a trumpet, nor does it arise in the halls of the influential. It starts in a moment of decline, in a city tearing itself apart, where truth is drowned by politics and courage is a rare commodity. The king wavers, the princes conspire, the prophet suffers, and amidst it all one man listens, not to the crowd, but to conscience. Ebed-Melech is not remembered for speeches or miracles. He is remembered for seeing what others refused to see, for stepping forward when silence was safer, for carrying ropes instead of weapons. His obedience did not shake the nations, but it moved the heart of God. This is not a story of might, but of mercy. It is about how heaven watches those who walk unnoticed by men. It is about the servant who became a signal of divine attention in a city that had lost its way. There is a kind of courage that announces itself with clashing swords and roaring crowds. It is the kind that history books admire, dressed in armor and crowned with victory. But there is another kind, quieter, rarer, and often unnoticed by men. It rises in silence, when the easiest choice is to say nothing, to blend into the background, to let injustice pass unchallenged because speaking might cost too much. This is the courage that found Ebed-Melech. Jeremiah, the prophet of truth, had become a problem. His words burned like fire, not because they flattered, but because they refused to compromise. He had warned the people of what would come if they continued down the path of rebellion against God. For this, he was despised. He was seen not as a messenger, but as a threat to morale, a traitor in the eyes of the political elite. And so, in a twisted act of punishment masked as protocol, the princes of Judah convinced the king to let them dispose of him. Jeremiah was lowered into a cistern, a pit without water, where only mud waited to consume him slowly. In the palace, many saw what had happened. Servants whispered. Officials looked the other way. The king himself had allowed it, shrugging responsibility like a robe slipping off his shoulders. It was in this silence, this choking, dangerous silence, that Ebed-Melech acted. He could have reasoned his way out of involvement. He was, after all, a eunuch, a foreigner in a collapsing kingdom, a man with no natural reason to interfere in the affairs of prophets or politicians. No one would have blamed him for staying quiet. It was not his war, not his people, not his prophet, and yet something stirred in him. Perhaps it was the memory of injustice he had known himself. Perhaps it was a conviction that rose like a voice inside his heart. But what is certain is this: he could not be silent anymore. He approached the king, not in anger or pride, but in boldness. In a time when words could kill, he chose to speak. And he did so alone. No crowd stood behind him. No one cheered him on. The palace walls did not echo with applause. Yet in the eyes of heaven, that moment rippled with power. For in that silent chamber, where everyone else had chosen comfort over conviction, one servant made a choice that aligned with righteousness. This is the heart of divine courage. not loud, not seeking attention, but willing to stand when everyone else is sitting, willing to risk position for the sake of justice, willing to be remembered not for power, but for faithfulness. It is the kind of courage that heaven recognizes, the kind that shifts the course of a life, and sometimes the course of a nation. Deep beneath the palace floor, in a stone cistern carved to hold water, but now filled with mud, the prophet Jeremiah lay trapped in silence. He had not been sentenced in court, yet he was punished as if condemned. His only offense was obedience to the voice of God, a voice that the nation had chosen to ignore. His warnings, once proclaimed in the open square, were now muffled beneath the earth, swallowed by a pit where sound barely traveled and hope seemed even harder to reach. This was no ordinary prison. There were no chains, no guards, only mud thick enough to hold a man in place and darkness heavy enough to crush the spirit. The prophet who had stood before kings now sank beneath the notice of the city he tried to save. His words had been inconvenient. His presence had disturbed the peace of a people content with self-deception. So they removed him, not with sword or stone, but with indifference and silence. In the palace above, life continued. The daily routines, the hollow rituals, the whispers of political maneuvering moved on as if nothing had happened. Those who had ordered his removal took comfort in their own power. Others, who may have known it was wrong, remained quiet, choosing safety over truth. And somewhere in the midst of it all, one man listened not to the noise of the crowd, but to the cry of a conscience touched by compassion. Ebed-Melech was not a man of authority. His position gave him access, not influence. He had no family in Jerusalem, no inherited rights, no cultural claim to the covenant. But he had something far more powerful in a moment like this, a heart that still felt. Where others had hardened themselves to survive in a world of compromise, he allowed himself to remain sensitive. He did not wait for a sign from heaven. He did not need a divine encounter. The injustice itself was enough. The cry from the cistern may never have reached the king's ears. It may never have shaken the princes, but it reached Ebed-Melech because he was willing to hear what others chose to ignore. The muffled groan of a prophet in the mud stirred something sacred in him, a call to act, not because he was commanded, but because he could not remain still. This is how God often moves, not through spectacle, but through the hearts of those who notice. The cry from the cistern is not only Jeremiah's cry. It echoes through history in the lives of the forgotten, the silenced, the abandoned. It is the sound of suffering hidden beneath the surface, the kind of pain that requires someone to lean in and listen. And it is through people like Ebed-Melech, those who choose to respond without waiting for recognition, that God brings the first rays of deliverance. In the world of kings and courtiers, access to power is carefully measured. Every step, every word, every glance must be weighed, especially by those whose positions are fragile. Ebed-Melech, a foreigner and a eunuch, belonged to the lower tiers of the palace hierarchy. He was useful, present, but not expected to challenge decisions made by Judah's elite. Yet in a moment charged with tension, when the life of a prophet hung by a thread, this servant crossed a line that few dared approach. He went directly to the king. The court of King Zedekiah was a place of shifting loyalties and fragile authority. The king himself, though seated on David's throne, was a man pulled in every direction, more afraid of his princes than confident in his own judgment. When Ebed-Melech entered the gates of royal power with a plea on behalf of Jeremiah, it was more than a personal risk. It was a direct confrontation with a political machine that had already chosen its course. Ebed-Melech did not shout, did not accuse, and did not present himself as a hero. He came with clarity, with sorrow, and with truth. He said plainly what others would not admit. The prophet had been wronged, and if no one acted, he would die. There was no attempt to flatter, no attempt to manipulate. Just truth spoken from the mouth of one whom society had taught to stay quiet. This moment draws out a powerful tension, the kind that always exists between truth and institutional power. Systems often protect themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. They reward silence, preserve reputation, and punish disruption. In such systems, the brave are not those who wield influence, but those who risk losing what little they have by speaking when it is neither safe nor popular. Ebed-Melech's act was not only an appeal for Jeremiah's life, it was a rebuke to the conscience of a king, a challenge to the complicity of the court, and a revelation of divine priorities. The God who sees in secret had seen enough. And now, through the voice of a servant, that divine justice was breaking into the chambers of worldly power. What makes this act even more remarkable is that Ebed-Melech had nothing to gain. There was no promise of reward, no prophecy that guaranteed his safety. He interrupted power because truth demanded it, and in doing so, he revealed the shape of true courage. Not the kind that waits for approval, but the kind that walks into the presence of kings with nothing but conviction. History remembers those who ruled, but heaven remembers those who stood. Ebed-Melech, unnamed in many lists and overlooked by many scribes, stepped into the eternal story of God's justice, not because he had strength, but because he had faith enough to speak when the silence became unbearable. When the king gave his reluctant permission for Jeremiah to be rescued, the command alone was not enough. Words could declare that the prophet should live, but it would take hands, rope, and resolve to lift him out. Ebed-Melech did not hesitate. He gathered 30 men, not because he needed them for strength, but likely because he needed them for protection, a quiet acknowledgement that even acts of mercy can provoke hostility when they disrupt the plans of the powerful. But what followed was not a hurried operation driven by fear. It was something more tender, more deliberate, and filled with compassion. Before lowering the ropes, Ebed-Melech went into a storage room beneath the treasury and collected old rags and worn-out cloths. These were not items of great value. They were remnants, forgotten, discarded pieces of fabric. Yet in his hands they became instruments of mercy. He tied the ropes securely, but before Jeremiah's arms bore the strain, he lowered the cloths and told the prophet to place them under his arms, between his body and the rope. The care was not extravagant, but it was deeply intentional. It was mercy with thought behind it, an act of grace that paid attention to pain. This small detail, easily passed over by hurried readers, reveals something profound about how God works through those who love him. Mercy is not only about delivering someone from danger, it is about how that deliverance is carried out. Ebed-Melech could have pulled Jeremiah up quickly and carelessly, arguing that speed was all that mattered. But love does not rush at the expense of tenderness. It sees the bruises that may not yet exist and acts to prevent them. Grace, when real, thinks ahead. It honors the dignity of the one being rescued, even in the mud. There are moments when God's mercy does not thunder from heaven, but arrives in the form of cloth, tied to rope, lowered by hands that care enough to think gently. This is a picture not of grand miracles, but of simple faithfulness. It is what happens when the heart of God moves through the heart of a servant. The ropes were necessary to bring Jeremiah back to the surface, but the rags revealed the nature of the one doing the lifting. In a world where help is often given with conditions, where kindness can be wrapped in coldness or pride, Ebed-Melech's act stands apart. He did not merely obey, he loved. And in that love, we see how even forgotten fabrics become sacred. The rags had no voice, no strength of their own. Yet in that moment they bore the weight of compassion. They carried the touch of a man who refused to let rescue come at the cost of more pain. These are the ropes of mercy, not only the tools that bring others out of darkness, but the thoughtful actions that wrap grace in softness. In the hands of Ebed-Melech, practical things became holy. Because where love is present, nothing is too small to carry the heart of God. There was no applause waiting for Ebed-Melech when Jeremiah stood again on solid ground. No crowd gathered to celebrate the act of mercy that had pulled the prophet from the mire. The palace resumed its rhythm. The same officials who ordered Jeremiah's descent into the pit carried on their duties, unmoved by what had just taken place. But heaven had not looked away. Though no one on earth had praised the servant's courage, a message was already forming in the heart of God, a message that would come back to Ebed-Melech in his hour of fear. He had not acted to secure reward. There were no calculations behind his rescue, no bargains with God, or plans to use this deed as leverage. He had seen suffering, and his conscience would not let him ignore it. He had stepped into danger not for recognition, but because something within him refused to remain still while injustice was done. His hands had tied the ropes. His voice had called down into the darkness. And now, in the midst of a nation falling apart, that same man received a message unlike any other. God spoke through the mouth of Jeremiah once more, but this time the word was not for kings or nations. It was for a single servant. While Jerusalem braced for Babylon's invasion, while fear spread like fire through its gates, Ebed-Melech heard the words that would anchor his soul. You will be delivered. You will not fall by the sword. You will escape with your life, not because you fought, not because you fled, but because you trusted me. This divine response was not repayment. It was remembrance. It was the confirmation that no act of faithfulness, no gesture of mercy, no whisper of compassion goes unnoticed. The ropes and rags that Ebed-Melech had lowered were not forgotten in the chaos of siege and smoke. The quiet choice to help a suffering man had risen like incense to the throne of God. And now, amid the roar of judgment, a promise was extended to the one whose only defense was trust. What stands out in this moment is not only the assurance of safety, but the reason behind it. God does not point to the man's ethnicity, his position, or his loyalty to any earthly authority. He speaks to his faith. Ebed-Melech had trusted, not in systems, not in his own strength, but in the unseen justice of a God who watches what others miss. That trust had shaped his action, and now it shaped his future. In times of collapse, when power structures fail and fear takes hold, it is easy to believe that only the strong will survive. But this story tells something different. It tells of a God who shelters those whose hearts have been shaped by righteousness. It reminds us that when we choose to see others, especially the hurting, the rejected, the silenced, God sees us in return. Not with vague approval, but with specific care, personal attention, and promises that stand even when everything around us falls. The skies over Jerusalem darkened not only with smoke, but with prophecy fulfilled. Babylon had come, not with diplomacy or warning, but with iron and fire. Siege towers loomed beyond the walls. Hunger crept into every home. The once proud city, swollen with pride and resistance, now trembled beneath the weight of divine judgment. Panic spread like wind through the streets. Families clung to rumors, officials turned on one another, and every man sought safety where none could be guaranteed. It was in this unraveling, this collapse of what once seemed secure, that a single promise broke through the noise, a word spoken not to generals, not to nobles, but to a foreign servant whose only claim to honor was a heart that had chosen mercy. Ebed-Melech stood in the same city as everyone else, surrounded by the same danger, threatened by the same destruction. Yet his story took a different turn. While walls fell and kings fled, while betrayal and violence swept through every corner, he received a divine message that cut through the chaos with clarity. God did not promise him power. He did not give him wealth or position. What he offered was far more precious, a shelter in the midst of judgment, the quiet assurance that when all else failed, the life of this man would be preserved. The power of that promise was not found in the strength of Ebed-Melech's arm or the cleverness of his strategy. It rested in something far deeper, his integrity. He had chosen to act when others remained passive. He had used his position, limited though it was, to protect life rather than preserve comfort. While others closed their eyes to suffering, he had opened his hands to help. And now, when the consequences of sin bore down on the city, God remembered. The difference between fear and peace in times of judgment is not the absence of danger, but the presence of divine favor. Ebed-Melech was not spared because he was lucky, or because he escaped notice. He was spared because righteousness builds a kind of shelter that no army can breach. It is not made of stone or iron, but of a life aligned with what is right, a heart that beats with justice even when it costs something. When destruction fell, he did not need to run. He was already hidden in the promises of a God who had seen his quiet courage. In a time when loyalty was rare and deception common, when prophets were persecuted and kings were powerless, Ebed-Melech's story stands as a beacon of hope. He was not immune to the storm, but he was protected within it. His obedience, though small in the eyes of men, became a shield in the hands of God. Ebed-Melech did not belong, not by blood, not by law, not by the expectations of a society that built its identity around ancestry and ritual. He was an Ethiopian in the royal palace of Judah, a eunuch without descendants, a man whose very presence marked him as different. To the people of Jerusalem, he was a foreign official with no real place in the story of God's covenant. Yet in the moments that mattered most, he revealed something far more important than background. He revealed faith. In a culture where lineage was everything and national pride ran deep, Ebed-Melech could have remained on the sidelines. His service to the king gave him access to power, but not inclusion. He was present in the palace, but not truly part of the people. Still, when the cries of the prophet rose from the cistern and no one else moved, it was this foreigner, this outsider, who stepped forward, not with authority, but with conviction. What unfolded in those days was not simply a rescue, but a revelation. While the religious elite ignored the voice of truth, and the native-born sons of the covenant hardened their hearts, it was the eunuch from afar who responded with compassion. His actions spoke of a heart aligned not with tradition or ritual, but with the God who values mercy above status, obedience above position, and faith above heritage. This story presses against the boundaries that human systems try to enforce. It declares that belonging to God is not about where you were born, how you were raised, or whether you meet the criteria others have created. It is about the posture of the heart, the choices made when no one is watching, the courage to do what is right when you have every excuse to remain uninvolved. Ebed-Melech's story is proof that faith is not confined to the bloodline of Abraham. It can take root in foreign soil, grow in an unfamiliar palace, and flourish in the life of someone the world considers unqualified. When God remembered Ebed-Melech, he did not mention where he came from. He did not refer to his title or his limitations. He responded to what mattered, his trust, a trust that moved him to act, a trust that carried him through danger, a trust that separated him from those who should have known better but failed to respond. This chapter of the story does not elevate the outsider for novelty's sake. It elevates the one who believed. It reminds every listener that God's attention is not fixed on the boundaries we draw. His favor rests on those who see his heart and then mirror it in their actions. In a book filled with kings, prophets, armies, and visions, it is striking that a quiet servant from a distant land would leave behind a legacy that reaches beyond borders and generations. Ebed-Melech never led a nation, never performed miracles, and never stood in a temple to teach. His story spans only a handful of verses, yet within those lines lies a heart that deeply moved the heart of God. It was not his status, his strength, or his wisdom that stood out. It was his compassion, his courage, and his willingness to act when no one else would. In rescuing Jeremiah, he did more than lift a prophet from a pit. He lifted truth from the mud. He reminded his generation and ours that righteousness is not defined by visibility, but by faithfulness. That justice is not a grand performance, but often a quiet step taken when it matters most. He did not seek to be remembered, yet God remembered him. He did not aim to be honored, yet heaven honored his name. This story is not only about what Ebed-Melech did, but about who he was. A man shaped not by privilege, but by principle. A servant in the eyes of men, yet a champion in the eyes of God. His life calls to anyone who feels unseen, forgotten, or small in the world's eyes. It whispers the truth that even when your actions go unnoticed by others, they are never missed by the one who sees in secret. Ebed-Melech's heart moved heaven, not because he was perfect, but because he reflected the character of God, merciful, bold, and faithful. In a moment of darkness, he became a light. In a season of judgment, he became a shelter. And in a city obsessed with power, he chose compassion. If this story spoke to your heart, if Ebed-Melech's quiet courage inspired you, take a moment to support this message. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this again. Like the video to help others discover it. Leave a comment, share what part of his story moved you the most. And most importantly, share this video with friends and family, because the world needs more examples of quiet faith that moves heaven.